ahead.
And he's not going to talk about this while you pull that up. But our second closest national park, second to the Everglades, is Congaree National Park, farther west from where he's going to tell about. But that is a fantastic park with these enormous trees and this floodplain swamp. So, all right, Craig, welcome.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, folks. Can you see the first slide now?
Yes.
All right, second slide. All right, so we're going to talk about South Carolina coastal birding. And as Deborah said, she and her group have been up here about 3 times, but not since COVID. So I'll just give you a brief overview of what you can kind of expect in coastal South Carolina. So there's about 1.5 million acres that is protected along the South Carolina coast in federal, state, and private interest. The really cool thing about it is that much of it is in private conservation easements led through an effort in the ACE Basin project area. And Deborah mentioned that earlier. So that's south of Charleston area, but there's just as much going on north of the Charleston area as well. So we have about 100 miles of shoreline protected as part of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. And the Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge was sort of the heart of that Shorebird Reserve Network site, but it was recently expanded with all of the shorebird use that this coast gets and how much of it is protected. So typically there's probably over 400 species of birds that you can see in South Carolina, most of those in coastal South Carolina. It's a very high raptor migration flyway. And the beauty of birding in coastal South Carolina is that you can sort of base in the Charleston area and access most of these public areas within an hour to an hour and a half, and have some very, very good birding during your stay here. So this is the outer coastal plain. This is what we're going to talk about, this area that's shaded in blue. If you look at this map, the red areas are the urban areas in South Carolina, and all of the green areas are protected either federal, state, or in private conservation easements. So there's a huge network of protected lands in coastal South Carolina. This is a very grainy photograph, apologize for that, but this just shows you the extent of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network and some of these great areas that are publicly accessible. You have to take a ferry out to Cape Romaine and get an appointment at Yawkey Wildlife Center, but all of these other areas are vast in acreage and harbor lots of shorebirds during the migration. This is just an example of what protected lands look like in the ACE Basin, and it's a mix of private, state, and federal lands. And this is just south of the Charleston area. This is Edisto Island down here, and this is the heart of the ACE Basin. Project area is over 1 million acres, and there's probably close to 350,000 acres that are protected just in this one region right here, and it's largely driven by private landowners. This is a really cool map that I helped work on for a photographer's book that she put together here in the Charleston area. And it just shows the historical kind of coastal South Carolina. And it talks about over here on the right, all these 20 different areas. And I'm going to talk about a few of these throughout the presentation, but these are all numbered on the coast here. And then the really cool thing about it is this little section down here talks about where the first black rail nest was found, the type locality of the Backman's warbler from 1832, ivory-billed woodpecker, passenger pigeon, all of these Carolina parakeets, all the sightings that occurred here along the coast here. So the coast of South Carolina is very rich in ornithological history, and this map sort of depicts it. And it's just a cool map I wanted to throw in there and show you all. All right, so major habitats in coastal South Carolina are beaches and dune, the ocean, both near shore and offshore, the maritime forest, mature pine forest, managed tidal wetlands, grasslands and early successional habitats, and the forested wetlands. The managed tidal wetlands we'll talk about quite a bit here. These are sort of the remnant rice fields from the rice culture that extends from, the Jacksonville, Florida area up to the Wilmington, North Carolina area. So 75,000 acres are basically functional in coastal South Carolina, but there's probably at least 200 to 250,000 acres that are in some sort of state of dysfunction. And a lot of the state and federal interest here, even private individuals, are working on getting permits to reinstate and rework some of these historic rice fields in South Carolina. But there's a lot of managed tidal wetlands in coastal South Carolina that gets a lot of use by shorebirds, wading birds, and waterfowl. Of course, this is just what the ocean looks like. This is off of Kiowa Island, beaches and dunes with the early, these are grasslands essentially. So we got sandy habitats, grassland habitats. This is the jetties at Huntington Beach State Park, and we'll talk quite a bit about this place throughout the presentation. This is a jetty, the South Jetty, that goes out into the ocean there, and is a great place for alcids when they come down from the north, and certainly a lot of gulls, terns, sea ducks as well. Just another look at the beaches and the sand dunes and the maritime forest located behind that. Example of the sand spit. I think Deborah, you and your group were here at one point. This is the North Spit on Hunting Island, just holds thousands and thousands of birds. Truly remarkable place. And this in the background over here is Edisto Island, and this is the St. Helena Sound right here. So just another look at the sand spit where Deborah and her group were. This is Harbor Island over here, Hunting Island to the left, but this sand spit on the North Spit of Hunting Island harbors thousands and thousands of birds. Good look at the maritime forest. The maritime forest is typically characterized by live oak, loblolly pine, palmetto, and magnolia. Beautiful, beautiful forest here in coastal South Carolina. Another good look at one on Edisto Island at Edisto Beach State Park. And then we get to our forested wetlands. We have a lot of river systems that flow from the upstate to our coast. And when we get down to the low country of South Carolina, essentially turns into cypress forested wetlands. Beautiful, beautiful forest. This is the Washoe Reserve right here along the coast near McClellanville, South Carolina, where there's a large wood stork rookery. This is an example of some of the managed wetlands in South Carolina. There's at least, as I mentioned earlier, 75,000 functional acres of this, mostly on federal and state properties, but many of them on private properties in the ACE Basin. And they're primarily managed for waterfowl during the winter, but also for shorebird migration in the spring and fall. Just an example of our vast salt marshes in South Carolina. We have probably 400 to 500,000 acres of pristine salt marsh in South Carolina. We're losing a little bit of it to sea level rise, but largely it remains intact along our coast. This is one of the other managed wetlands. On the left here, you see a rice trunk. This is an historic rice trunk that has been, it's a replica of a historic rice trunk that this technology was brought from Africa in the 1600s and is still used today throughout all of coastal South Carolina in these coastal managed tidal wetlands. This is an example of what we find in some of these tidal wetlands during the wintertime. The waterfowl, this is on a private plantation up in Georgetown County, but just thousands and thousands of waterfowl on these areas. Also holds large numbers of shorebirds. Here you can see some American avocets in the front and dowitchers in the rear. Just another example. It's interesting that David mentioned about how many white-rumped sandpipers were moving through where he was doing some birding today. And we've noticed that in South Carolina just in the past few days as well. Lots of white-rumped sandpipers showing up here. This is a good example of black rail habitat in South Carolina. It's Spartina bakeri. This is on Bear Island Wildlife Management Area. This is one of the most reliable places to find or hear a black rail in South Carolina. And then we have our mature pine forest, most notably red-cockaded woodpeckers and all the other, mature pine species, obligates that inhabit here. We'll talk about some of those later as well. Just another example of a red-cockaded woodpecker, open mature pine forest. You see the red-cockaded woodpecker cavity trees right here with the white bands around them. And then we have our grasslands, and we have scattered grasslands throughout the state. This one happens to be at Fort Moultrie National Monument right in Charleston Harbor. It's where a lot of our rarities show up and a lot of our grassland species. This is another look in the dunes and the grasslands around Fort Moultrie. All right, so I'm going to go through these bird groups, and I'll try to go through these rather quickly because that is a lot of birds to talk about and go through. But for waterfowl, we have 44 species of waterfowl that occur in South Carolina. All of them are found on the coast. We have the puddle ducks, the diving ducks, and the sea ducks, and most people are really interested in the sea ducks. Black-bellied whistling ducks are very, very common here now. It's interesting to note that when I first moved here 30-something years ago, the fulvous whistling ducks were the common tree duck here, but now they've essentially left South Carolina, and we have black-bellied whistling ducks now. So we have 10 species of goose and swan. Tundra swans are the major attraction. We have these other geese, but they're kind of rare, but we do get more snow geese sort of up in the Midlands toward the Columbia area. We have all the puddle ducks occur here. Most people are after American black ducks and the mottled ducks. You know, mottled ducks, of course, you have in Florida there, but we almost always get Eurasian widgeon and cinnamon teal in some of these managed tidal wetlands during the winter here. And of course, the diving ducks, folks are just enamored by canvasback and redheads here, and we've been getting more and more common golden-eye during the winter months here. The sea ducks, we have all 3 scoters that occur here fairly commonly, just offshore, along with long-tailed ducks, lesser scaup and greater scaup. Harlequin is not so common, but we still have black scoters and surf scoters lingering here off our coast. Some were just seen today down off of Kiowa Island. Here's some tundra swans fly by. Greater white-fronted goose used to be very common here. Now it's pretty rare sighting when we find one, so people go chase these greater white-fronted geese when they show up. Ross's goose, you know, shows up occasionally in the Myrtle Beach area. I'm not sure why they like that area, but they do. And then there's mottled ducks that people love to come see here in South Carolina. And then, of course, a lot of people come to see the black ducks in South Carolina. Here's our Eurasian widgeon, long camera shot for myself this past winter. So we do usually get 2 or 3 of these that show up every winter, and those are a real treat for folks to find. Canvasbacks. Just recently, we had a tufted duck out at Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge, and it stayed for a couple of weeks. Took me, 3 attempts to find the bird, but did find it. And it's a $40 ferry fee to get out there. So the bird cost me like $120 in 3 days to see it. But we do get rarities like this tufted duck that shows up on the coast here. Then the long-tailed ducks in the wintertime, common eiders, and then the harlequin duck. Most of these usually show up around Huntington Beach State Park area. And then we have all the species of scoters here, and most of these guys are still here right now, except for the white-winged scoter. Just an example of some of the ducks that flush up in some of these managed tidal impoundments, literally just thousands and thousands. In this one particular photograph here, during that day was a field trip for some dignitaries from the Fish and Wildlife Service and other partners around the Southeast. We estimated there was like 50,000 pintail just in this one impoundment down near Bear Island Wildlife Management Area. So waterfowl is big in South Carolina during the winter, and a lot of these managed tidal wetlands are specifically managed for waterfowl during the winter. Grebes and loons, we have 5 species of grebes and 3 loon species here. Horned is, of course, the most common. We do get eared, redneck, and western grebes at times, although they're pretty uncommon. Red-throated loons are super common here during the winter. About 80% of their population winters off the coast of North Carolina and South Carolina, so we do get a lot of red-throated loons here. Pacific loons are rare, but they do show up occasionally. Horned grebe, common loon, red-throated loon. All right. For the pigeons and doves and cuckoos, we have 10 species of doves and cuckoos here. Common ground dove is a sought after species. I know they're much more common in Florida than they are here, but we've lost a ton of habitat with the coastal development out here. We do find them occasionally on some of the populated barrier islands here, like Isle of Palms and Sullivan's Island, but mostly you have to go down to places like Botany Bay Wildlife Management Area on Edisto Island, or over onto Dewey's Island, where there's very, very little development and disturbance to find these common ground doves. And white-winged doves, we're getting those more increasingly every year, and I've even had a few in my backyard feeders for the last few years. So yellow-billed cuckoo nest here. Black-bill is only a migrant through here, but everyone looks for the black-billed cuckoo when they come through here. White-winged dove. There's a common ground dove sitting on a line at Botany Bay Wildlife Management Area. For the nightjar, swifts, and hummingbirds, we have 14 species. The chuck-will's widow and the eastern whippoorwill's nest here. Common nighthawks are a migrant through here. Our only swift is the chimney swift. We have 9 species of hummingbirds that have been recorded in coastal South Carolina. The ruby-throated breeds here, but one of our most common winter visitors is a black-chinned hummingbird. And this past winter, Pam and I hosted a black-chinned hummingbird at our feeder for a little over a month, and dozens and dozens of birders were able to come by and see it. There was apparently black-chinned hummingbirds winter along the western Gulf Coast, and there was this huge storm that came through just before Christmas time and pushed a lot of these birds over to the east. So there were a lot of black-chinned hummingbirds showing up on the East Coast here this past December. Ruby-throated hummingbird, and here's a little black-chinned hummingbird that stayed for about a month or a month and a half. And about the same time, a rufous hummingbird showed up. It's another fairly common winter visitor here along the coast here in South Carolina. For rails, gallinules, coots, and cranes, we have 12 species. Clapper is the most common. The most sought after are the king rails, the black and the yellow rails. So king rails are fairly common in freshwater habitats here. We don't have that much freshwater marsh here, but there is some north of Charleston in the Georgetown area and scattered pockets of it around the coast, so you can find them. Yellow rails are really, really difficult to find. They're only a wintering bird here, but they are found in some of our impoundments. So they are flushed when managers mow the panic grasses down for the waterfowl in the winter. So they're very difficult to find. You have to be right there when people, the managers are mowing these fields, but very, very difficult. Pam and I did have one on the ACE Basin Christmas bird count this past winter, but they are very, very uncommon to find. Although they're here in good numbers, you still find them. Oh, excuse me. All right, for black rail, that's a species that I worked on for the last 6 or 7 years with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I have never seen a black rail in South Carolina. Of course, there are folks here that trap them and work with the rails here, so they know they're there. I have only heard black rails here in South Carolina. Virginia and Sora are winter visitors here. Purple gallinules, we're kind of at the northernmost limit of the breeding range of that species here. Sandhill cranes are casual, and once upon a time, we did have quite a few whooping cranes from the experimental population that was wintering here during the heyday of all the captive breeding at Patuxent and the use of the flights down south. So we don't have those any longer, but they have been here once upon a time. Purple gallinule, Sora, Virginia, and that's the only black photograph of a black rail I have. It's just a carving that I had from a local carver here in the Charleston area. And then there's the clapper rail. Limpkin, limpkins now breed in South Carolina. And Deborah, when you were here last, I don't think the limpkins were breeding here. We just found them breeding here beginning in 2020. So they're just north of here, in Hanahan on the Goose Creek Reservoir. A lady posted a picture of this bird on Facebook and was asking about this bird. So we recognized it right away as a limpkin, and then went up and saw it. This was in August of 2019. Another bird showed up in December of 2019. We watched that pair, and then they had young in June of 2020. And now we have limpkins breeding in at least four different areas in South Carolina. Right here in Charleston and Berkeley County on Goose Creek Reservoir, Hilton Head area, and the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge in Horry County, and just most recently up in the Congaree Swamp. So these birds are thought to be following the movement of that exotic apple snail out of Florida. So if you look at the movement of those exotic apple snails, they go all the way over to the eastern Gulf Coast of Texas, and that limpkins are breeding over there now. So you have breeding limpkins now that just kind of exploded out of Florida up through coastal Georgia and South Carolina, and all the way across the Gulf Coast over to eastern Texas. So I estimate there's probably at least 8 pairs of limpkins nesting in South Carolina now, all here along the coast. So that's a real treat for everyone to see. We don't know if the limpkin, these exotic apple snails are causing any kind of ecological concerns yet here in the low country, but you know, a lot of folks are watching that. It's one of the limpkins photographed. I mean, I have a story here about the limpkins. Few years ago, and this is only in 2018, Pam and I walked 9.5-mile round trip to see a limpkin in Congaree Swamp. And now essentially you can drive up to them here in South Carolina and see them. So quite a change over the last 4 years. For shorebirds, you know, there's so much to talk about shorebirds in South Carolina. There's 48 species recorded in South Carolina. 40 are more common. All of them are found essentially on the coast here. Even those that use the grasslands and the short grasses, like in the sod farms, are found here, right here along the coast. So we have probably the densest American oyster catcher wintering area in Cape Romaine National Wildlife Refuge. We have wintering American avocets. That didn't occur years and years ago. We have nesting blackneck stilts. That didn't occur years ago. That's all has changed since I've moved here over 30 years ago. We have all the plovers that are found here. Even the golden plovers come through here and use the sod farms and some of our managed tidal wetlands. We have a subpopulation of red knot here, the roofer red knot. There's probably at once upon a time, probably 8,000 to 12,000 individuals of this subpopulation using the beaches of coastal South Carolina and Georgia. That's down to probably about 7,000 now, but these red knots do not go all the way to Argentina like the other segment of the larger population. They winter here, spend their time here, feed upon the horseshoe crab eggs here, and they totally skip Delaware Bay and go all the way up to the tundra to Nah. So there's this sort of subpopulation of red knot here in South Carolina, and I just saw some of these yesterday, and they're in their full breeding plumage, so they're here. Most recently, we had a bar-tailed godwit show up about 1.5 years ago, and it's hanging around. Kiowa Island is the first record for a bar-tailed godwit in South Carolina. That's an easy bird to go see if we can get access to Kiowa Island. Some other birds that show up quite frequently are rough and purple sandpiper. And of course, we have all the peeps, the yellowlegs, the dowitchers, and dunlin. So just a lot of shorebirds. Both migration seasons are just great to watch the shorebird migration here. One thing that's been recently discovered here in South Carolina is about the whimbrel, and regarding DeVoe Bank. DeVoe Bank is a small island just off the coast of South Carolina between Edisto Island and Seabrook Island at the mouth of the North Edisto River. It is a bird nesting island, so there's pelicans, skimmers, tricolored herons, gullible terns, other species that nest here. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, some biologists started seeing these large numbers of whimbrels coming to the island in the evening. So they wanted to investigate and find out what was going on with whimbrels coming to this little island. And what they found was that during the entire month of May, whimbrels stage on this island, and they leave the island in the morning, go out into the marshes and feed on fiddler crabs all day long, fatten up for a month, and then make their final trek back to the north. But the astonishing thing is that there's 20,000 of these whimbrels that use DeVoe Bank for the entire month of May, and that's half of the Atlantic population of the whimbrel. So if you're interested in seeing a movie about that, if you would to just use your search engine and go to Discovery at DeVoe, you'll find like a 9.5-minute film that Cornell put together on the whimbrel phenomena at DeVoe Bank. All right, here's the bar-tailed godwit, purple sandpiper, whimbrel, American avocet, black-necked stilt in the surf here, some red knots, American avocets and dowitchers here. Lots of semi-palmated sandpipers. This is on a sand spit on Deweese Island. At certain times of the year, all of these sand spits are just loaded with shorebirds. For the Jaegers and Alcids, we have long-tailed palmarine and parasitic Jaegers here. The parasitic is the most common. During sort of some eruptive years, we do get dovekies, common and thick-billed murres, and black guillemots and razorbills. And I recall seeing photographs of razorbills in Florida just a few years ago. So we do get those here, not regularly, but occasionally. You know, most of those are around the Outer Banks, and that's their limit of their southward movement. Occasionally, we do get some movements down here, and those are typically found at Huntington Beach State Park and Myrtle Beach State Park. Gulls, terns, and skimmers, you know, most same thing that you usually find in Florida, about 13 species of gulls and 14 species of terns and skimmers. Get both species of tropic birds offshore if you can get offshore. The most uncommon species we've had here lately is that wandering Heermann's gull, black-legged kittiwakes and little gull, and the slaty-back gull found at the Horry County landfill. That's where a lot of folks go to get a lot of the gulls in this area. So, and for the terns, you know, we do have roseate terns that occasionally stop here at Huntington Beach State Park. And during, you know, storm years, we get bridled, sooty, and brown noddies coming through the area. So depending on a lot on the tropical systems that come through here. So sandwich terns, black skimmers, Caspian terns, black skimmers. For pelagics, we have 7 species of petrels, 5 species of shearwaters here, and you can read those a lot. There's a lot of pelagic trips that are run out of North Carolina. South Carolina used to run some pelagic trips, but when the red snapper fishery crashed years ago, that stopped. So there are essentially no pelagic trips that go out of coastal South Carolina anymore, unless you were to charter an offshore fishing boat. So that's unfortunate, but that's something that I'm working on to try to get birders back out on the ocean to see what we've got out there. Also, the Gulf Stream is probably fluctuates between 40 to 60 miles offshore here, much further than it is off the coast of Florida and off the coast of North Carolina. So it does take quite a bit more effort to get out there, and because of that, it costs more in fuel to get out there, and it's usually more expensive for birders to get out there. So we do have all these species out there, it's just hard to get out there. Storks, frigate birds, and boobies. South Carolina now has 20% of the North American population of wood storks. They started moving out of Florida back in the late 70s up here. Frigate birds becoming more and more common in our summer months here. One was just reported from here yesterday, so they're here right now. Get brown boobies coming up here pretty frequently. And, you know, of course, some are driven up here through, you know, tropical storm events and that kind of things. Northern gannets are our biggest, you know, booby here during the wintertime. Very, very common offshore. Pelicans and cormorants. Brown pelican is the common one here. But we do have American white pelicans here year round now. Occasionally we get the great cormorant in the winter, but typically it's the double-crested cormorant. Here's some white pelicans. All right, herons and egrets. Tons of herons and egrets, bitters and ibis, just like in Florida. The interesting thing I wanted to point out here was that we now have roseate spoonbills nesting in South Carolina, and that they also began nesting in South Carolina in the year 2020. And Deborah, if you can remember where we went to the Edisto Nature Trail,
Yes.
Swainson's warbler, they are nesting just on the same river system, just across the highway with that big wood stork rookery over there. So spoonbills are moving up out of Florida as well, and they now nest in South Carolina. Here's some spoonbills in South Carolina. So, all right, vultures, ospreys, eagles, the raptors. We have 19 species. Coastal South Carolina is a major raptor migration flyway. Botany Bay has a volunteer station there that is manned during the fall migration, and it's really only second behind Cape May and the Florida Keys station there. It's remarkable how many hawks and raptors come along coastal South Carolina. Truly amazing. At one point in my lifetime, I never thought I would see a peregrine falcon. Of course, peregrine falcons have rebounded greatly now, but in one day I saw 59 peregrine falcons during migration on one day. So truly a spectacle to watch during certain times of the fall. So we also had a crested caracara show up here. There's been kind of one wandering around up and down the coast here of the East Coast here in past years. So the bird that everybody wants to come see here is the swallow-tailed kite. They're a very charismatic species here, and the Francis Marion National Forest used to be the northernmost nesting for that species, but when Hurricane Hugo came along and basically destroyed that forest, it really destroyed these transitional wetlands these super dominant loblolly pine trees where these kites nested. So they've actually shifted north. So we're getting nesting swallow-tailed kites in the Cape Rear River System in North Carolina, and a lot on the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge just north of Charleston. Here's the caracara that showed up a few years ago. Owls, 9 species of owls. We do get some of the rarities. Long-eared, snowy, short-eared owls, burrowing owls. I'm not sure how some of these species get here, especially the burrowing owls. That's a good one. Some people think that these burrowing owls come up with loads of landscaping materials from Florida. So I guess that's a good theory. I don't really know, but there are a couple of good places you can find short-eared owls in South Carolina. One of them being Huntington Beach State Park. Also, if you get to any of the wildlife management areas in South Carolina, you'll see these barn owl boxes erected throughout the area, and they have almost 100% usage by barn owls in those nesting boxes. Kingfishers and woodpeckers. We just have the belted kingfisher, of course, and then 8 species of woodpecker. Several places you can get all 8 in one day. The key being is to where to find red-cockaded woodpeckers. And here's a red-cockaded woodpecker. Deborah mentioned earlier about the use of artificial cavities. Here you can see one on this side of the screen. So prior to Hurricane Hugo hitting the Francis Marion National Forest, there were about 500 active clusters of red-cockaded woodpeckers on the forest, and that went down to about 120 overnight from one hurricane. We lost 90% of the cavity trees and about 65% of the birds themselves. So at that time, we didn't know what to do, but Dave Allen, who was working with the Forest Service at that time, had just designed this insert box type of artificial cavity, and then Carol Copion at North Carolina State University had designed this drilled type cavity. They had never been tested before, so we decided to test both techniques on the Francis Marion National Forest, and with probably I think over 3,000 artificial cavities have been put in the national forest net right now. These birds have grown, their population has grown tremendously. There are over 500 active clusters on the national forest now. And the beauty of it is they're building their own cavities now. They're not relying on these artificial cavities, but this technology has been transferred to essentially every national wildlife refuge, every national forest, and every state management area from East Texas to Virginia, and even on private lands to reestablish red-cockaded woodpecker populations throughout the Southeast. So a major tool in helping this species kind of overcome the hump of habitat loss that we've experienced in the Southeast. Flycatchers, I have 19 species of flycatchers. And we have had 2 fork-tailed flycatchers here in the past couple of years. We have scissor-tailed flycatchers that are nesting now up in York County, but we have all these other species that show up at odd times of the year. Western kingbirds are probably the most common one that we have, and that's during the winter time. But a couple of years ago, we did have the great kiskadee that showed up at Bear Island Wildlife Management Area. Here's a tropical kingbird, Western kingbird, gray kingbird. Gray kingbird just showed up over on the Isle of Palms about 3 or 4 days ago. So I've been over there to photograph it. So gray kingbirds are here. This is a scissor-tailed flycatcher that was taken out in the grasslands at Fort Moultrie National Monument, just a short drive from my house here. And this was the fork-tailed flycatcher that kind of popped down in a tree. 3 of us were birding over at Fort Moultrie, and someone hollered flycatcher, and we just assumed it was a scissor-tailed flycatcher since it had a long tail. It landed, and it was a fork-tailed flycatcher, an adult at that. So beautiful bird. Vireos, we have 9 species of vireos. Of course, only 4 or 5 of them are common here, but all of these are captured at a banding station on Kiowa Island. So we know that they occur here. They're not seen very regularly, but they are here. Shrikes, crows, and jays, usually, same thing that y'all have in Florida. And loggerhead shrike is a species that's declining in our part of the world. And it's good to keep an eye out on that species and record it whenever we can. Titmice, chickadees, and swallows. And of course, we had Carolina chickadee, tufted titmouse. 7 species of swallows. Cave and cliff swallows are becoming more common here on the East Coast. Purple martins are very abundant here, and we have a large roost of at least 1 million birds on one of the man-made lakes near here. So very common. Kinglets and nuthatches and creepers, ruby crown and golden crown in the winter. We have the brown-headed, white-breasted, and red-breasted. We only get the red-breasted during the winter time, during the winter eruptions, and the brown creeper is a good bird to see. Here's a red-breasted nuthatch, and here's our brown creeper. Gnatcatchers, wrens, and mimics. We have all those just like you do in Florida. We don't have the Bahama mockingbird up here, so I might be taking a trip down to Florida to see that soon. The species of marsh wren that we have here is the Worthington's marsh wren, the Griseus form, the gray form. It's a year-round resident here. It mixes in with other populations of the wintering other marsh wrens here as well. So we get both of the regular, the marsh wren and the Worthingtons here in coastal South Carolina. 10 species of thrushes. We even had the Townsend solitaire show up here again at Huntington Beach State Park. But we get all of these thrushes during migration here. Of course, no one can really identify Bicknell's thrush very confidently here. And none, as far as I know, have been trapped at any of the banding station. But all the other thrushes that migrate through here, like Wood, Swainson's, Great Chieftain, Beery, are here. Waxwings, we have cedar waxwings here. American pipits are pretty common here during the wintertime. We have had some rarities like the white wagtail show up again at Huntington Beach State Park, and Sprague's pipit at Huntington Beach State Park. And some of these others are a little bit more common here, although they don't occur here every winter, but snow bunting, lapwing, and chestnut-collared longspur, and Smith's longspur. And again, in the grasslands, at the dunes, at Huntington Beach State Park. snow bunting here at Fort Sumter National Monument 2 years ago. Okay, finches. 9 species of finches, same that you all get down in Florida. We didn't have many pine siskins this winter. They're sort of an eruptive species. We have had common redpoll here in Charleston area, but typically we get purple finches and pine siskins only in the eruptive years. Otherwise, goldfinches and house finches are very common. Sparrows, we have 26 species of sparrows. A lot of people come here to see the marsh sparrows, seaside Nelsons, and salt marsh sparrow. The salt marsh sparrow is another species that I worked with in my job with the Fish and Wildlife Service over the past 6 or 7 years. That species is expected to go extinct in 2050. It's on the verge of being listed as endangered. There's a ton of work going on this species in the Northeast in the breeding marshes, and it's really linked to sea level rise. The marshes in the South where the species winters are generally pretty good for the species, but it's these marshes in the Northeast that are being inundated with this accelerated sea level rise that are causing the species to crash. Essentially, this species only has 23 days during the breeding season to pull off a clutch of birds. And if they can't do that between those high tide cycles, then their nests are flooded out. And that's the reason for the species population crash. So Backman sparrow is a pretty common sparrow here in the piney woods. We do have occasional Henslows and LeContes in these grassy understories in our longleaf pine systems. And the eastern towhee, we have that just like you all do in Florida, and the white-eyed version of that one. There's a salt marsh sparrow. Okay, chat and other icterids. South Carolina has the largest wintering population of Baltimore orioles anywhere in the state. I don't know why, except I know that there are a ton of people here that put out jelly feeders every year all along the coast. And you can actually use your search engine and look up Baltimore oriole wintering in South Carolina, and there'll be several publications about the numbers of Baltimore orioles that are here during the winter time. It's really, really remarkable. Most recently, we've had Bullock's orioles showing up in the wintertime at these feeders, which is a real treat for folks here. Bobolinks are a real common migrant through this area. So here's our Bullock's oriole, just at a local feeder here, just about a mile from my house. These are my feeders out back. I have jelly out, and I have 16 to 20 Baltimore orioles during the wintertime here. Some people have 30 to 40. It's truly a remarkable kind of thing. Right, warblers. We have all the eastern warblers in the United States are found in South Carolina. Even some of the more rare western ones show up here. This Townsend's warbler showed up in Huntington Beach State Park. But anyway, at some point throughout the year, all of the eastern warblers are found in coastal South Carolina. Some of them are not easily observed, like the Connecticut and Morning and Kirtland's warblers, but these birds are captured at these real scrubby dune grassland areas on Kiowa Island at the banding station. Some of the more sought after eastern warblers here are the Swainson's and Kentucky warbler, and Deborah and her group's been to this one place, the Edisto Nature Trail, where we've been successful in seeing those birds right down on the Edisto River in southern Charleston County. Cardinals, buntings, grosbeaks, and tanager, we have 11 species. The painted bunting is the most notable one here. South Carolina sort of has the highest density of the breeding population of the eastern population outside of Florida, but we get all these other species as well. So the scarlet tanager is only a migrant through here, as is the rose-breasted grosbeak. The dick sisal is a migrant, however, it does nest up toward the Columbia area on the Santee National Wildlife Refuge. So it nests in very low densities in that area up there. This is the painted bunting, more painted buntings, western tanager. shows up occasionally. All right, so let's talk about some of the top birding areas in coastal South Carolina, so you can be thinking about where to come in South Carolina. So the state parks are great here. The Huntington Beach State Park, Hunting Island State Park, where that North Spit is, where there's literally thousands of water birds there at certain times of the year. And then there's Edisto Beach State Park. The State Wildlife Management Area, Santee Coastal Reserve, Bear Island, Samworth, and Donnelly Wildlife Management Areas. Santee is north of Charleston, Bear and Donnelly are south, and then Samworth is up near Santee Coastal Reserve. National Wildlife Refuges are Cape Romaine and Waccamaw, north of Charleston, then the ACE Basin and Savannah National Wildlife Refuges, south of Charleston. Fort Moultrie National Monument right here on Sullivan's Island in the Charleston area is one of my favorites. Has a large accreted maritime forest, plus all those extensive grasslands and dunes where a lot of rarities show up. Also close by is the Francis Marion National Forest, 260,000 acres. And then there's the Charleston County Park System. Huntington Beach State Park has 338 eBird species. It's the highest diversity eBird hotspot in South Carolina. It has all of these habitats, all of these things that we've talked about at the beginning and throughout the presentation are found at Huntington Beach. And you heard me mention Huntington Beach State Park throughout the presentation. It's just a marvelous place to bird, and I encourage you to go there if you get the chance. Hunting Island, that North Spit, you're mostly going to find shorebirds, seabirds, and water birds, but it is just awesome to see all the thousands of birds that utilize that North Sand Spit between Hunting Island and Harbor Island. Sandy Coastal Reserve is 24,000 acres just north of the Charleston area, primarily managed for waterfowl, but the manager up there also manages for shorebird species, which is great to hear. 287 eBird species there. Also the same number of eBird species at Bear Island, south of Charleston. That's 12,000 acres. It is closed along with portions of Donnelly from November 1st to February 8th. So you want to time your visits there to when these places reopen on February the 9th. Locally, Kaw Interpretive Center, Folly Beach, and the Lighthouse Heritage Preserve, and then Beachwalker Park are some county parks on some of our barrier islands and sea islands. Great places to bird. The Francis Marion National Forest right near Charleston, 260,000 acres, really known for its red-cockaded woodpecker population and the mature pine forest species that occur there. And again, one of my favorites here is Fort Moultrie National Monument. Then you got Lighthouse Heritage Preserve. These two areas are on both sides of the Charleston Harbor and really capture these rare birds and these migrants during seasonal migration. They act as migrant traps on the Charleston Harbor. So you get these rarities here, like the fork-tailed flycatcher, scissor-tailed flycatcher, kingbirds, olive-sided flycatcher, just amazing places to bird. All right, so if you come to coastal South Carolina, whether it's on your own or with me, I would take you to some kind of combination of all of these sites. You could probably in a week here or 4 or 5 days see 150 to 200 species on a trip. Our spring migration here for passerines is not good at all. The fall migration is pretty darn spectacular here at times. A lot of these birds are pushed to the coast and forced to come right down the coast during the fall because of the weather patterns. There's a great raptor migration here in the fall. Both spring and fall migration periods for shorebirds are great here. We have the wading birds year round. Winter waterfowl is spectacular here. And then in the summertime, we have these great species like the painted buntings, Backman sparrows, Swainson's warblers, grosbeaks, indigo buntings, and on and on. So the times that I would recommend that you were to come would be in the winter for waterfowl, particularly right after it opens up on February the 8th. So it's closed through February 8th. So February 9th is the first day it's open. All those waterfowl will still be here. And then the managers will start drawing those managed tidal wetlands down and providing all that shorebird habitat. So it's a great time for shorebirds also. Fall shorebird migration is great, and fall passerine and raptor migration is great during the fall. So those are the times of the year that I would recommend coming. And we can build any kind of a trip, and I'm glad to help anyone out that's interested in coming to coastal South Carolina. But if you were to go birding in South Carolina, these are the like 8 or 9 places I've highlighted where you can see essentially all these species and hopefully some rarities in coastal South Carolina. And you can base out of Charleston, and some of these places are only 10 minutes away, and some are just like an hour and a half away. Huntington Beach is the furthest away from here, but it's an easy drive up Highway 17. So north of Charleston would be Huntington Beach State Park, Santee Coastal Reserve, and the Francis Marion National Forest. Cape Romaine requires a ferry to get out to, but it's still a wonderful place to go. Right here in the Charleston area is Fort Moultrie and the other county parks here in Charleston County. And then south of Charleston is Barron, Donnelly, Hunting Island, Edisto, and then Kiowa. Kiowa Island is an awesome place to get. It's a little tough to get in there, but I can get people in there with a pass from some friends down there. So it's a private island. So anyway, that's really all I have to offer. I know that was a lot, and I know I went through it quickly, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them.
It's a great place, and you know it like the back of your hand.
Yeah. Well, I've been here 34 years, so I've had a lot of experience exploring these places and continue to do so.
All right, Karen is saying very interesting and informative. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I have a question. You keep saying that a lot of the birds are starting to move upward. Do you think that's from, is it the rising waters, or do you think it's temperature changes?
Well, I think it depends on which species you're talking about, but I think it's a combination of both, and Audubon has documented northward range shifts of a lot of breeding species in the Southeast due to climate change. So that is occurring. So the limpkins are essentially moving out of Florida because of the movement of the exotic apple snail. And, I guess you could question whether that is climate related or what. I don't think it's really known, but these snails are moving pretty darn fast out of Florida and up the East Coast and over across the West Coast. Spoonbills, I think a lot of it has to do with conservation of species, particularly in Florida. I mean, there's a lot of great conservation going on in Florida. A lot of the species are doing well, and their populations are just growing. And I think that's why the spoonbills have moved up this way. Lots of great habitat in the ACE Basin, and I think they began showing up here in about 2015, year round, every month of the year, and we just knew they were going to be nesting soon, and eventually did in 2020. And I think it's just because of the excellent habitat that's provided up here as well. So good conservation, in Florida and other states, it's providing habitat, and the populations are doing good. Some of these species, though, like the black rail, they live in that high marsh. So a lot of these managed tidal impoundments mimic the high marsh. So that's why we have black rails in these managed tidal impoundments. We don't have them along the coast anymore in our tidal marshes. They've essentially been extirpated from all the tidal marshes north of here. North of North Carolina, you won't find a black rail. So that's one of the beautiful things about Florida as well, is for the black rail. Florida is really the stronghold of the black rail in the eastern US, outside of coastal Texas. And it's because of all the inland habitats that aren't influenced by tidal situations where these birds typically occur. So there's a lot of rails that occur in these water management areas and these state wildlife management areas on the federal refuges. And it's because it's not affected by sea level rise, and you have that high marsh type habitat that's provided in those impoundments. So it's a combination of both, I think. Sea level rise, climate change, increasing temperatures.
Before people all leave, let's get your email down. Oh, read it off to me.
You want me to put it in the chat?
Yeah, you'll put it, okay, perfect. Yeah, and he'll be here this winter for the Shorebirding Festival. You'll see him again here. He's the one that got us into doing black rail trips at that St. John's National Wildlife Refuge. Hope we can do them again this year. The water levels are better.
Yeah, I do too. We'll just have to wait and see how it goes.
Yeah.
I'll try to work with Mike to see if we can find a a substitute area in case that area is flooded again. So
Uh-huh. Yeah.
you know,
Well, I'm sorry, what?
in case that area,
So anyways, a fantastic area, and thank you very much for this introduction to it.
thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
I didn't mean to cut it off quickly. David Simpson, you've never been there, have you?
I've only been to Savannah National Wildlife Refuge, but I haven't been to pretty much any of the other places out there. So, but it is a fascinating area, and it's not that far from Florida. That's the thing. That's
That's
it's
a big
farther to
thing.
drive out to Pensacola than it is to drive to coastal South Carolina, I think. So, because it's so much farther across the panhandle, really. So,
And one of the fun things is that the birds are singing up a storm, our birds that we know in the winter.
yeah, you get some of the breeders up there that, and well, it's just a fantastic area, I know, but I just haven't spent that much time up in that area. I've gotten as close as I've been in a few spots in coastal Georgia, I guess, and northeast Florida, but yeah, the coastal ecosystems definitely change as you get up past Jacksonville up there, and it's just, as a naturalist, it's even more fascinating than just the birds, just seeing the change in the ecosystems and the different and the coastal ecosystems up there versus ours on the central East Coast, and it's just so different and fascinating and interesting now that spoonbills and limpkins and black-bellied whistling ducks are moving up into that area now too. That's just kind of weird. I mean, I remember when black-bellied whistling ducks, you didn't even see them in Florida that much. I mean, back in the day, it was bulbous whistling ducks.
Right.
And
Yeah, I know it's definitely changed over the 30 years that I've been here, and those are certainly some of the species that I like to talk about relative to change.
Yeah.
One other species too is we never used to have black-necked stilts here at all.
Oh, really? Okay.
Now they nest everywhere here in these managed tidal impoundments.
Huh.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, they do tend to find ephemeral habitats. I mean, if Lake Okeechobee is down, they'll nest all around the edges of Lake Okeechobee. So they probably just, if you change the management of those coastal wetlands, they probably just happened to discover it. And once they did, they just started, kept coming back in more and more numbers. But
Right.
We had a bunch at TM Goodwin today because the water's down in the area where the tern was hanging out and the shorebirds are there, and there's stilts nesting all over the place out there because it's just this marsh that's been reduced down to mud flats out there, and that's what they like. There's baby stilts all over the place. There's more still sitting on nests out there. So we'll keep managing. They'll keep coming back there. So
it's definitely an interesting landscape here. Highly influenced through the rice culture. Sort of after the rice culture, a lot of the wealthy Northeasterners came down during pre-Clean Water Act days and constructed waterfowl impoundments. So you have sort of the old rice field impoundments plus the constructed waterfowl impoundments, but they're essentially all managed the same way, for hunting waterfowl during the winter, but provides a lot of habitat for the wading birds and shorebirds and the rails.
Yeah, I just came from the biggest week in American birding up in Ohio,
Yeah, I
and
saw you up there.
same sort of situation up there. They have all those wetland areas that were managed. That's what saved what little bit of the black swamp is still there, was waterfowl hunting basically up in that area. So,
Yeah,
but
well, then you're familiar with the new Howard Marsh that was just constructed
oh
from
my
last
gosh,
year.
yeah,
Yeah, that
that's
was,
incredible.
yeah,
Yeah, got to see a little gull out there this year
yeah,
that showed
I
up. That
saw,
that
I
was
saw that. Yeah,
first one I've seen since 1990, actually, down here in Florida. So it was almost a life bird, but not
yeah.
quite.
Same for me. Same for me.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, that was yeah. Because our rice fields here in Florida are mostly around in the sugarcane area, south of Lake Okeechobee, in
Mhm.
between. Well, some fields they grow rice every year, but a lot of times they grow it in between sugarcane crops. So they get about 3 years out of a planting of sugarcane, and then in between they'll often put in rice or something else, corn or some other winter vegetable or something like that. So, and we do get black rails in those rice fields actually, um, at certain stages of it. I've also had black rails out in the sugarcane fields a number of times, not a whole lot. But the other curious thing about the cane field area is there's not a lot of mockingbirds out there, but around buildings and houses there'll be mockingbirds, and every single mockingbird does a black rail imitation out there. So
Really?
so they got to be hearing it somewhere. And when I
Right.
was
Yeah,
doing
exactly.
surveys, I
Yeah.
did a couple of years of surveys out there, roughly 5 days a week every other week for a year, and then 3 days a week every other week for a year. And I had, two sightings of black rails, hearings of black rails out there during that time. One was at 11 o'clock in the morning in the middle of a cane field. The other was at midnight. We had a couple out in the area, and I've had them since then off of Brown's Farm Road, and other people have had them in the rice fields out there. But also, we had one black rail during the month of August. Every morning and every evening, he was out kicky-doing away in a little piece of pasture in the middle of sugarcane fields. There was a pond there, and he was somewhere out there. I couldn't tell exactly where he was, but for several weeks he was out there every single day calling like crazy out there. So they get in weird habitat sometimes. They get them in the reclaimed phosphate mines here in Florida, in Southwest Florida a lot too. And I have not seen the habitat where they're at there, but I have heard from other people that they get fair numbers of them out there. So I think I think it's really the structure of the habitat that they key in on, because one of the aquatic invasive plants that we have here in Florida is Cuban bulrush, and it comes in and takes over waterways and just forms this thick mat. It's relatively short, but it appears that it may be open underneath, so the rails can run around underneath. It creates a little
Right.
mat on top of the water, because we're hearing black rails, and we're pretty sure they're in the Cuban bulrushes out here in parts of the St. Johns River floodplain. And it's always hard to tell exactly where they are, when you're hearing them out there. But the
Well,
structure of that habitat seems to be, open at the ground level and with a canopy overhead, so they don't
Right.
get nailed by harriers and stuff like that. And that's the kind of habitat that Mike Legary the general structure of the habitat that he was describing to me for St. John's National Wildlife Refuge, where to look for them. After they burn an area out there, the rails will kind of move out of it for the first year and a half or so, because the grass is not dense enough to protect them. But once it comes in and there's enough of a canopy to protect them from aerial predators, then they'll move into that area until it gets too thick for them to run around on the ground underneath, and then they have to burn it out again after about 3 to 5 years. So
Yeah.
anyway, so
Well,
I don't
there's also that bulrush in the Lake Apopka North Shore
Yeah.
right now. Somebody needs to do a black rail survey.
They could be in there. They do seem to be in the stormwater treatment areas a lot. South Florida Water Management District is doing surveys, have volunteers out doing surveys, and the Flow Equalization Basin has a ton of them, of black rails out there. And I haven't been on that place yet, but I think the STAs also tend to have them. In Fort Drum Wildlife Management Area is one of the places locally here where we've had them in that Cuban bulrush habitat out there, it looks like. But yeah, our stormwater treatment areas seem to be providing great habitat for both snail kites and potentially for black rails out there too. So
Yeah, I know in the, about a year and a half ago, when I was working with some folks in Florida, the construction of that C-44 reservoir, you familiar with that?
I've heard of it. I've not been there, but I've heard of talking
Yeah,
about
so
that.
that was a huge, water holding reservoir under construction, and then some invasive grasses moved in there.
Okay.
And the contractors were required to do surveys, and they found 30-something black rails in there.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I mean, they're, I think they move around on the landscape there a lot, depending on, where
Yeah.
that is.
What was the grass species? Do you remember the?
I don't remember, but so you got my email. Well, I can get you in touch with the person who can probably get you that report.
Yeah. Well, I know I worked with South Florida with your Martin County Audubon a bit. I'm trying to remember, blanking on the name of the person we were working with. There's a couple guys down there though, but anyways, yeah, because they were the ones that were talking about C-44. I remember him talking about that, the potential for opening it. So Brian Garrett, I think, was the guy we were working with.
Yeah, Brian Garrett, right?
Yeah. That's curious though, because it does make it's kind of difficult to manage for them when they're using all these weird different habitats and trying to figure out how do you manage for them when they're using phosphate mines and sugarcane fields and Cuban bulrush, and all that. So what's the commonality between all of those that they're keying in on?
Yeah. Yeah, shoot me an email. We'll get a
Okay.
discussion started. Yeah. Good.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Excellent. So, okay.
Well, thank you, Craig. It was great.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.